Hello, everybody. In Trump 2.0 age, I'm going to start again, David. Hello, everybody. In our age of Donald Trump 2.0, we have a new term. It's called Trumpagees, people who have left America because they don't care for a certain Donald Trump. They include all sorts of different people. A number of people from the LGBTQ plus community, especially the trans community, are understandably, I guess, fleeing. A number of celebrities, including Ellen DeGeneres, Rosie O'Donnell, and James Cameron. Many academics, too. Perhaps the best known are Tim Schneider, Marcy Shore, and Jason Stanley, all students of fascism. Who left America at the beginning of the year. But this isn't the first time. Maybe Trumpagees is the first time when it comes to Donald Trump. But this isn't the first time this has happened in American history. And my guest today, David Mayers, who teaches history at Boston University, has a new book out. It's called Seekers and Partisans, American Abroad in the Crisis Years 1935 to 1941. David is joining us from his home in Newton, Massachusetts. David, congratulations on the new book. Is history repeating itself now with all these Trumpagees?
History is certainly running in a parallel track here. It's not an exact duplication of the past, but for a very long time, in fact, Americans have gone abroad for a variety of reasons. This since early days of the Republic, as a matter of fact. Andrew, if you'll hang on for a moment, my dog is scratching at the door. If I let her in.
Okay, well, we'll start again. Why don't you let the dog in, and then we'll do it. We'll start again. Okay, David, we'll do this again.
Yeah, sure.
Otherwise, it'll require a lot of editing. Okay, ready to roll here? Yeah, good. Hello, everybody. History seems to be repeating itself. We have a group called Trumpagees, people leaving America because they don't care for a certain Donald Trump. Some of these people are from the LGBTQ plus community, particularly trans Americans who are fleeing America because of Trump, perhaps understandably. A number of celebrities have left, including Ellen DeGeneres, Rosie O'Donnell, and James Cameron. And then, of course, there are the academics who are fleeing. The universities are being shut and unfunded, and a number of very prominent academics, including students of fascism like Marcy Shore, Timothy Snyder, and Jason Stanley, announced that they were leaving America at the beginning of the year. But as I said, history is repeating itself. This isn't the first time this has happened, and perhaps not the last time. My guest today, David Mayers, who teaches history and political science at Boston University, has a new book out, Seekers and Partisans, Americans Abroad in the Crisis Years, 1935 to 1941. David is joining us from Newton in Massachusetts. David, congratulations on the new book. Is history repeating itself, David?
Andrew, it's not repeating itself exactly, but it's certainly running a parallel track just now. Americans, really since the early days of the Republic, in fact, have, for a variety of reasons, gone abroad for varying lengths of time. Some of these people have been cultural refugees. Other people have gone for political purposes, thinking somehow that elsewhere is better than the US and that there is greater fairness, greater justice, greater possibility for meaningful life.
Is this just the nature of things? Americans might be shocked, some perhaps even offended, because America is supposed to be an immigrant community offering freedom and democracy for people around the world. But many people throughout history in every country and every culture have left because for one reason or other, they don't care from where they're from. So does this make America different or similar to the rest of the world?
I'm not sure if it makes it qualitatively different. the expectation, I suppose, traditionally has been different. The U.S. as an immigrant society has depended on this idea, really, it's mythological as much as anything else, that in America, one can build a sturdier life than was available elsewhere. At the same time, though, of course, people have gone abroad impatient with the U.S., disappointed with the U.S. And then, of course, there have been critical political moments. You think of the large number of people, for example, who went to Canada during the Vietnam War, partly to escape the draft, also because they didn't want to lend themselves to what they perceived as an unjust war. I think something like 100,000 people went to Canada over the years of that war. Certainly there are similarities with other countries, people who left Europe in large numbers to escape, say, conscription or all of the instability of European life, say, in the 19th century. But all of this cuts against the grain of American.
Yeah, it's almost like an assault on the promise, the idea of America, what some people call the American dream. People like Shaw, Snyder, and Stanley, and I'm sure you're familiar with their work and their story, have suggested that America now is in crisis, or at least American democracy is in crisis. The subtitle, David, of your new book is Americans Abroad in the Crisis Years, 1935 to 1941. Why were these crisis years? Who invented the term crisis years? Is this your term, or was this a term that existed broadly, particularly amongst progressives?
This is a term that I use for the book, and this, Andrew, was part of a larger conversation with the publisher. That wasn't the original idea for the subtitle, but it's the one that...
It's always the publishers, David. But I assume you think that they are, quote unquote, crisis years. Otherwise, you wouldn't have written the book.
Indeed, yes, of course. And of course, the crisis was, it had many dimensions to it. There was the collapse of international order, beginning in 1935 with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, and then, of course, running through the rest of the 30s. And then for the Americans, entering the war in December 1941. The most pressing crisis, however, as felt by Americans during that time, was of a domestic nature, the failure of the economy, a whole set of New Deal emergency measures to get the economy floating again. But this was a period of massive unemployment and demoralization.
And of course, crisis is a relative term, as you suggested. Maybe might not be quite the right term to describe this period. But in America, between 1935 and 1941, it was a different kind of crisis from certainly the quote-unquote crisis in Germany or Italy or even France, certainly the Soviet Union as well. So, I mean, we didn't see, I take your point on the collapse of the economy and the nature of the international system, but we didn't see the collapse of American democracy, did we, David?
Well, I'm not sure exactly who we refers to.
We being observers.
Right. Well, I think there was a spectrum among observers, some of whom felt that politics in the States was not working. There were, as you know, people who were highly critical of FDR's government. They felt that the president was overreaching in all kinds of ways, that he was maybe a pseudo-socialist or worse, that he was in any case accumulating too much centralized power, and that the democratic nature of the country was beginning to falter. There were people on the extreme left who felt that democracy in this country was just formulaic. It was ritualistic. It did not correspond with any meaningful sense of equality or justice. And there were other places, better places, the Soviet Union notably, where things were on track. And then, Andrew, there were people on the extreme right who felt that in fascist Italy or Nazi Germany, that the problems of modern society were taken seriously, they were being dealt with in a responsible way, and that the wave of the future lay in those settings, and that American democracy was feeble, fragile, and on its way out.
It's interesting, David, that I assume whatever the publisher's choice of subtitled words, you chose the period 1935 to 1941. Given that the crisis began, of course, on Wall Street in the late 20s, why didn't you begin the book in 1930 or 1931?
My first concern in writing the book was to deal with international problems and with the coming of World War II and U.S. Intervention in World War II. That's what drove the book. And it was only somewhat later that the economic questions, the racial questions, the class questions entered into the book and then became so prominent as they did. But Andrew, to your question exactly, I wanted to get into the problem of World War II, or what we call World War II, which in fact was really kind of a merging of separate wars, beginning in Africa, in Ethiopia, in East Asia with China and Japan, and then of course eventually engulfing Europe.
So would it be fair to say, and we're going to get to some of the characters in your book, the seekers and the partisans, that they're all opponents of this war? Does anything unite them in terms of their decisions to leave America?
What unites them, I suppose? That's a good question, and it's one that I've wrestled with throughout writing this book. Some of them were eager for the United States to get involved and to either align itself with the Western democracies, with France and Great Britain, and to pose a kind of united front to the revisionist powers of Germany and Italy. Others, however, Ezra Pound is a good example, were lobbying for the Americans to stay out of Europe, not to get involved in Europe. So again, they're all over the place. But what they have in common, Andrew, to your question, is that they were all profoundly dissatisfied with the United States, with their place in the United States, and felt that in both domestic politics and in its foreign relations, the US was invariably taking the wrong turn.
Again, history seems to be repeating itself, although you're the historian here, David, but my understanding is that there were many Americans, for example, in Paris in the 1920s. Hemingway comes to mind, many other writers and thinkers. Fitzgerald was there for a while. What was different about what you call the seekers and partisans in the late 30s or the second half of the 30s from the Americans who flocked to Europe after the First World War?
I think, and I'd have to give this greater consideration, but I think it's fair to say that those people who went to Europe, Hemingway, the Lost Generation, and all of that, they were, and Ezra Pound is a good example of this, they felt that in the US, there was really little room for creative or imaginative or artistic people that that Europe was the place where things happened intellectually and artistically, and so they flocked there. The people in the later 30s, their orientation, more often than not, but not always, but more often than not, was political.
Let's talk then more specifically about your seekers and partisans. You've noted that Pound is a bridge, perhaps in his own way. Ezra Pound, the American poet and critic, proto-fascist, was a bridge perhaps between the 20s and 30s. Tell me about Pound, why he's a central figure in your narrative.
Well, he was, Andrew, really the foremost American apologist for Mussolini. There were other Americans who, at one time or another, and again for various reasons, were enthusiastic about Mussolini. But Pound was the most articulate, the most vigorous, and of course, he was a member of the artistic avant-garde. He, by nature of his personality and his following, enjoyed a great deal of so adulation. And when he got behind Mussolini and broadcast on Rome radio programs extolling Mussolini's virtues, so-called, this was all rather keenly followed. In writing this book, Andrew, and this is a more fundamental question, there's always the problem of who to select, of who to concentrate on. And what I tried to do in these different chapters was to identify people who were good of their kind. I couldn't be encyclopedic. That would have been impossible.
So to borrow a sociological term, these are ideal types. Pound was an ideal type, a proto-fascist. And in a sense, then, the fascism that he was idealizing, wasn't it more a fascism of the late 20s than the late 30s, when the Nazis were in power, and the sort of the, shall we say, the romance of early fascism, the modernism, the modernists who idealized Mussolini, that they were replaced by power. Was Pound himself, was he disappointed ultimately with what Mussolini was or wasn't doing? And what was his opinion about Hitler?
Pound never lost confidence in Mussolini. Not even after 1943, when Mussolini was overthrown, and then what little power he exercised was simply the result of German support. And even after the war, Mussolini continued to say favorable things about Mussolini and his regime. He never lost faith in Mussolini. You asked about Hitler and the Nazis. Pound also looked favorably upon Berlin and Hitler's regime. Pound also, of course, among other things, famously was anti-Semitic, and all of that worked well enough in his defense of the German Third Reich.
I mean, what was Pound's response? He died in 1972. I'm just curious. What was his response to the Holocaust after the Second World War? Was he horrified, or did he say that these were people who meant well?
I don't know what his private thoughts were, Andrew.
Well, what were his public thoughts? Did he acknowledge after the war whether he had been mistaken to idealize Mussolini and Hitler?
No, he didn't. Never.
What does that say? I mean, he clearly was a poet of some ability, but what does this tell us about perhaps intellectuals or poets? David? Does it suggest that politically they're rather infantile?
Well, again, I think like any set of people, large set of people, they are all over the place. And we have this notion, I think, and it's a romantic idea, that somehow poets are especially attuned to humanity and to kind of moral uplift, and that they are more sensitive and I suppose more progressive than other elements in society. That is nonsense.
But it's certainly nonsense with, as I was going to say, Ezra Klein, Ezra Pound. Let's move on to another very well-known figure who is part of your narrative, Seekers and Partisans. W.E.B. Du Bois, very different kind of character, not a poet, from who left America. Where did W.E.B. Du Bois go? And tell us why he went.
He wound up eventually as an older man, much older man, in Ghana, and he died in Ghana. He went to, but in his earlier days, in his prime, he visited a number of countries, Soviet Union, China, most memorably, and he was always looking for, I guess you would say, Andrew, the promised land, the promised land of racial equality, of socialistic justice. He was restless. He in the end, he gave up on America. For much of his life, he felt that the United States could be reformed and improved upon, but he became, in the end, utterly disillusioned.
I mean, given obviously the racist history of America, of slavery, of the failure of Reconstruction, of Jim Crow's America, should we be perhaps a little more sympathetic to W.E.B. Du Bois's departure from America than somebody like Ezra Pound? I mean, he may have fallen for Stalin's lies. He may have been seduced by the great seduction of Pan-Africanism, but it's much more understandable given the catastrophic history of American race and racism and slavery.
It's entirely understandable, and indeed, one can have all kinds of sort of sympathy along the lines that you just suggested for Du Bois. At the same time, however, he was blind to some of the problems abroad. He felt, for example, that the Japanese empire, as it was developing in the late 1930s, was going to be a more humane version of imperialism, a more humane version of colonialism than what the Europeans had established in East Asia or in Africa. Again, understandable in some ways. He felt that Japan, as a country made up of colored people, was going to be the agent for overthrowing white supremacy in Africa and Asia. But in his eagerness, he overlooked the ruthless side of Japanese imperialism.
Another African-American who you feature in the book is John Robinson, who will be perhaps less familiar than W.E.B. Du Bois, an American aviator and activist. Tell me about him. I know in 1954 he died in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in Africa. So what's interesting about Robinson? Why is he part of your narrative?
He's a fascinating figure. I knew nothing about him going into this book. He was a pioneer aviator.
So a kind of a Black Lindbergh in a sense.
Exactly right. Exactly right. He was from heavily segregated, really terrorized Mississippi. But he became an aviator. He lived much of his life in the Midwest, in Illinois. he eventually wound up as the senior responsible officer in the Ethiopian Air Force at the time of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. By some set of miracles, he survived the war. In any case, he was part of the response widespread among African Americans who wanted to do something for Ethiopia at the time of its emergency, the Italian invasion. Very few African Americans actually got to Ethiopia. It was too far away. It was expensive to get to. The State Department didn't want Americans going into a war zone and so forth. But Robinson actually got there.
Yeah, and of course he was fighting the Italian fascists who Ezra Pound idealized.
Well, indeed. And on the subject of Ethiopia, Pound said all sorts of unsettling things, really terrifying things about how Italy in Ethiopia would modernize the country, would do all sorts of wonderful things for it. As you know, the Italian invasion and occupation of Ethiopia was ruthless.
And so Robinson comes out. I'm assuming that he comes out of the book in much better shape than Ezra Pound.
Undeniably.
He didn't idealize Soviet communism or Japanese colonialism as W.B. Du Bois did. Did he have a politics? I mean, or was he just essentially an adventurer who happened to be in Africa?
I don't know what his practical political preferences were. He did feel committed to the civil rights program in the United States. I would say that civil rights was his politics. Whether he was a Democrat or a Republican, a socialist, or anything else, I have no idea. What made him tick was a commitment to civil rights justice.
It's tough enough for a man to go overseas, but you feature a number of women, Agnes Smedley, Helen Keller, and Anna Louise Strong, American women who left. Is there a particular challenge for women, or was it in a sense easier given that the America that they left of the mid-30s was run by men and dominated by men?
I don't know if it was easier. And the places they went to were not necessarily gardens of gender equality, far from it. They had to make their way in difficult circumstances in those countries as well.
Sorry, David. I just had to close the door. There was some noise. We'll continue. So let's break these women down. Let's talk about Agnes Smedley, an American journalist, writer, who was very much involved in the Chinese Communist Revolution. She was originally from Missouri. When did she leave, and where did she go?
Her original idea was to go to India. In earlier days, she had been involved with Indian nationalists who wanted to promote Indian independence, to get rid of the British Raj. And she, yes, India was a place that she wanted to go, but through a weird chain of circumstances, she wound up in China. And in China, she had the most remarkable career. She was employed at one point by Soviet intelligence. She was a news reporter. She threw herself into the doings and the programs of the Chinese Communist Party. She fought with Chinese communist guerrillas against the Japanese invaders. She was everywhere and a charismatic personality.
There were many people in Europe also who idealized communism. The Webbs, for example, famously went to the Soviet Union, and many idealized what was happening in China. Were these women, Anna Louise Strong is another example of an American journalist who reported on, supported communism. Were these characters, a Strong or an Agnes Smedley, were they any different from the Europeans, the Western Europeans, who were essentially duped by the supposed humanity of the Soviet Union?
I don't know how different they were. Anna Louise Strong, she was a committed humanitarian. She was intelligent. She was well educated. She did, I suppose, have a keen sense of adventure. She fell in with very sort of idealistic-minded people. As years went by, however, she became sort of orthodox and dogmatic, and betrayed her better intellectual self.
So why would you include her? I mean, some of these characters are, I don't know if they're pathetic, but rather sad. To leave America, which, I mean, whatever one says about it, you might not have liked FDR, you might have feared some of his powers. It had nonetheless resisted both communism and fascism, maintained its democracy. Does someone like Anna Louise Strong come out of this book looking rather ridiculous and pathetic?
Well, I don't know, Andrew. I think she evolves in the book. I think early on, this is a sympathetic character. Her instincts were pacifistic. She was against U.S. intervention in the Great War or World War I. She was a proponent of racial rights, of labor rights.
Was she pacific? Was she peaceful when it came to, I don't know, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Mussolini's invasion, or Hitler's colonization of Eastern Europe?
Well, I wouldn't say she was a pure pacifist. And certainly by the time Germany attacked the Soviet Union, she was eager for the Americans to do more on behalf of the Soviet Union to contain Germany. No, so she was not a pure pacifist, but I think, again, if we can distinguish between the young Anna Louise Strong and the older, again, her reflexes were to find peaceful resolution to international problems.
Well, who doesn't want peaceful resolution? But in the mid to late 30s, wasn't that rather absurd, given the behavior of the fascists and the Nazis?
Well, it was certainly a minority position. I don't know if it was absurd.
But it seems absurd now. Maybe at the time it seemed less absurd. I mean, was there criticism from the left or amongst progressives of people like Strong and Smedley and others, even Du Bois? I mean, the Snyder decision, for example, Snyder and Stanley and Shaw's decision to leave the US at the beginning of the year, it was quite controversial. A lot of progressives thought, firstly, that this is absurd, and secondly, it's kind of irresponsible. If they really care about America, they should stay and fight.
Yes, well, there are a couple of answers to your question. Some people on the left, especially in the case of Anna Louise Strong, got completely fed up. She fell into bad odor with the Soviet Communist Party. She was eventually deported from the Soviet Union soon after World War II. And she was then, in the eyes of American communists and other leftists, but especially the American Communist Party, she was tainted. She was seen as a kind of a traitor to the Soviet Union and to the progressive cause. The other part of your question is, the answer goes something like this, I think. Exactly as you suggest, there were people who felt, well, look here, the situation in America is dreadful, and the duty of a responsible person is to stay and to resist, not to go overseas.
Stay and resist what?
Well, again, if you were extreme leftist, you would have felt that America dominated by the rich tycoons, by a kind of creeping dictatorial state.
What, in the late 30s under FDR?
Well, again, there's a spectrum, but for somebody like Anna Louise Strong, just to concentrate on her for a moment, again, the U.S. was so far gone, so brittle, that there wasn't much to keep her.
So what do you make of a woman like Strong? She seems to me to be completely absurd, delusional, in fact.
Yeah. Andrew, I take your point, and I think there's a lot to it.
I mean, I'm not suggesting she's Tim Snyder, but this sort of the delusional quality to exaggerate how bad things are in America seems to be a feature of American intellectuals, particularly progressive intellectuals. I'm not suggesting that Tim Snyder is Anna Louise Strong, but there is that element of always over dramatizing how bad things are in America, whether it's Trump's America or FDR's America. That's my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Certainly there were people on the left who again, just to repeat what I said before, who said that this was not the time to leave a sinking ship, that one should stay with the ship and do what one could to right it.
Who is the American, if there's an equivalent of Orwell at the time, of course, who was addressing similar issues in the UK, especially when it came to the promise of supposedly of Soviet communism? Sinclair Lewis wrote in 1935, "It Can't Happen Here," imagining America in a kind of dictatorship. Of course, Philip Roth later wrote a book, The Plot Against America, on similar themes. Was there an American Orwell, a hard-headed progressive who was telling the truth about the world, who did indeed travel and saw, perhaps spending time in the Spanish Civil War, recognizing that the Soviets were no better than the fascists? Or no worse, for that matter?
No worse, yeah. I would have to think about that. I don't have a good answer.
Well, you're the historian. If you have to think about it, there clearly wasn't an Orwell. Why not? Why not, David? Why is America 10 times bigger or 8 times bigger than England? Why was it unable to create a George Orwell and create these rather absurd characters like Anna Louise Strong, and even people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who's a very distinguished thinker, but who sort of perhaps in some ways stained his own reputation, let alone people like Ezra Pound? Not that there weren't proto-fascists and communists in Western Europe.
Well, I think smart people can get things dreadfully wrong, and that's what happened in some of these.
Well, maybe they're not so smart. How can smart people get things dreadfully wrong? That doesn't make them smart anymore, does it?
Yeah, I don't know. Part of the reason may have to do, Andrew, this is just sort of grasping at straws here, but the United States, of course, is geographically so removed from Europe. Europe in the 30s, not that Europe was abstract exactly, certainly not, but it wasn't in the neighborhood, and firsthand experience counts for a lot here.
One of the characters who seems a little more sympathetic in the book, slightly less absurd, is Helen Keller, very famously associated with disability rights advocacy. Herself was a disabled woman. Why did she leave, and what's her story?
She went to Japan in 1937, just before the Sino-Japanese War erupted. And she went originally in order to heighten awareness in Japan, sympathetic awareness for people with disabilities, especially people who did not have sight or hearing. And she was enthusiastically received in Japan, celebrated, and she raised funds for people living with disabilities in that country. She had to cut short her time in Japan and in the Japanese Empire. She went to Manchukuo briefly. She was scheduled to go to Japanese occupied parts of China proper. But the war broke out. She had to leave. Her original idea was to go back to Japan in the early 40s. But again, the war got in the way. She didn't go back to Japan until after the war. And in her time there, I think it was 1948, she went to Hiroshima, she went to Nagasaki, and she broadened the scope of her activity to include anti-nuclear weapons.
Do you think that the American decision to drop two nuclear bombs on two atomic bombs on Japan in some ways vindicated the behavior of somebody like Keller, who and others perhaps who were very fearful of American military power?
I'm not sure about the term vindicated. She deplored the use of those atom bombs. She felt that the use of the bombs was criminal. But again, and her reason for going to Japan originally was on behalf of people with disabilities.
Is she your? I mean, I suggested maybe she's slightly less absurd than some of the other characters in the book. Who's your favorite from Seekers and Partisans? Who's the character who perhaps comes out of your story with the degree of nobility?
Well, there are a number of people that I'm drawn to. I'm not sure I can identify a single person.
Well, give me a couple, because we got to end, David. But I'm curious as who your models, if heroes, people you really admire in your own book. You've obviously invested a great deal of time in this.
One person who I especially like is Mildred Fish Harnack, and she was a native of Wisconsin. She was a student of American literature and more broadly of Western literature. She wound up marrying a German national. They made their home in Germany. They were intent on pursuing academic careers in Germany. She loved Germany as the land of poets and thinkers. She was a Germanophile, you might say. She wound up with her husband in the anti-Nazi underground, and they paid the price. They were both eventually executed. She is, I think, by any convention,
a remarkable story, actually.
An incredible personality. So I'm very much drawn to her. And even people like Anna Louise Strong and some of the others that you've mentioned.
Being a bit unkind about poor old Anna Louise Strong, do you think?
Well, I don't know if you're unkind, but I'm disinclined to be quite so severe. I think she was massively wrong-headed.
But then, if you make that argument, well, you could make the same argument about Ezra Pound, couldn't you?
He was a bigot, and that's the difference.
He didn't like what, blacks and Jews, whereas Anna Louise Strong didn't like wealthy people. Does that make him less of a bigot or more of a bigot than Anna Louise Strong?
Yes, well, she certainly saw the world through sort of class lenses, and that may be a problem. But the racial and religious bigotry in Pound is really hard to take. Same with.
No, I'm the last person to be justifying Pound. I'm not suggesting that we should be sympathetic to him. I'm just suggesting, wondering whether we should be more sympathetic to people like Anna Louise Strong.
Yeah, well, another disagreeable figure in this cast of characters was Philip Johnson, the architect.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about him. Finally, David, because we have to end in a second. Tell me about Johnson.
About Philip Johnson, well, of course, esteemed American architect, who, among other things, was infatuated with the Nazis and became an apologist for the Nazis. He was later hugely embarrassed by his pronouncements on Nazism and tried to distance himself from all of that and said that these were the mistakes of his youth, nothing more than that. But in fact, on closer examination, he was, like Pound, a thoroughgoing bigot.
Yeah, I mean, I think excusing one's youthful infatuation with Hitler and the Nazis is a hard thing to take seriously. Finally, David, it's a very interesting narrative, and maybe, as you said, history is in a sense repeating itself for people, for potential Trumpagees, people who are thinking to themselves, I'm not sure if America's for me anymore. I know a number of younger Americans, in fact, who have said to me they're waiting till next year for the midterms and then they'll decide whether to stay or not. If they read your book, Seekers and Partisans, what would they learn about whether or not one should choose to leave America?
Well, if they read this, and Andrew, I also know many people who want to go elsewhere. But what I say to them are two things. First, one's obligation, I believe, is to stay here and to help salvage the situation. The other thing is that it's an illusion to believe that things are all that brilliant elsewhere. They aren't. The human condition is too complicated, too frustrating.
Even Denmark, David.
Well, maybe
even the Danes who are colonizing Greenland as we speak.
Yeah. So
what you're saying is, do your homework for people who are thinking of leaving America. Do a little research on Denmark or Germany or France or wherever you're thinking of going. Have you ever considered leaving, David? You're obviously a man of great political sensibility. Do you feel that sometimes America's a bit too much and it's time to leave? I know you grew up overseas at times.
I have felt that tug, that temptation. All of my siblings at one time or another have lived abroad for a very long period. Some still do. But I try to, I mean, you asked about me personally. No, my position is to stay here, come what may.
Well, there you have it. That from the master, David Mayers, Seekers and Partisans, his new book, Americans Abroad in the Crisis Years, 1935 to 1941. Important historical book, but also very important, I think, series of thoughts about current America for people considering leaving. Think carefully, as David said. Things aren't quite as ideal as overseas as sometimes they seem, firstly. And secondly, perhaps things aren't quite lost in America. David, congratulations on the book. Continue to seek. Thank you so much.